I've kept a dead man's silver pocket watch in my desk drawer for 22 years. Every summer, when the midnight sun casts a long shadow across the tundra, the second hand starts ticking backwards.
It doesn't make a normal mechanical sound. It sounds heavy, hollow, and deliberate, kind of like a massive iron vault door clicking shut.
Like an ancient debt being tallied up in the dark. I was the lead search and rescue ranger out here in the Alaska range for a really long time.
I know the rules of the ice better than anyone.
I know that the extreme cold preserves things out here. It preserves fallen trees, footprints in the permafrost, and the bodies of those who underestimate the wild.
And if you aren't careful, it preserves your darkest sins, too.
You can bury a secret under 6 feet of snow, but the spring thaw always comes. Out here, the mountain has a memory. If you've never been to the deep Alaskan interior in late June, you can't possibly understand what the light does to a man's mind. We call it the season of the midnight sun. For weeks, the sun never truly sets.
Your circadian rhythm just shatters.
You don't sleep, you just rest with your eyes closed, feeling that endless daylight pressing right against your eyelids. My partner back then was a guy named Arthur Miller. Miller wasn't a woodsman by nature. He was basically a politician wearing a fleece jacket and a badge. He was sharp, sure, but driven by this desperate need for recognition. He didn't love the wilderness. He just viewed the mountain as a stepping stone for his career.
I, on the other hand, just wanted to keep people alive.
That fundamental difference in our character is exactly what got a 22-year-old kid named Julian frozen solid on the western slopes. The kid we were looking for was named Julian, just a 22-year-old photography student from Seattle who thought he could conquer the wild with a camera. He was way out of his depth.
He wandered off the marked trails to catch the alpenglow, and a violent whiteout storm swallowed him whole.
When we finally got boots on the ground, I knew right away something was off with Miller. He was usually obsessed with the details, but this time he was just impatient. He kept looking over his shoulder, aggressively pushing us to focus the search teams on the eastern ridge. It made absolutely zero sense. The wind had been blowing west. Novices always walk with the wind at their backs. When I told him that, he snapped. He pulled rank on me right there in the snow, threatening to call it a recovery mission. He said we were wasting time and resources, sir. But honestly, it wasn't just his attitude that was bothering me. It was his boots. They were caked in this pale, chalky dust, pulverized limestone. And there was only one place in our entire patrol sector with exposed limestone deposits. A treacherous off-limits ravine on the western ridge. The exact place Miller was demanding we avoid. He was lying to me, and he was hiding something bad. I didn't know what he was hiding, but a sick knot formed in my gut. So that night, while he slept in his heated tent, I broke protocol. I didn't radio at him. I just grabbed my ice axe and hiked out toward the western ridge alone. The silence out there at night, it's heavy. Out there in the deep wild at night, the silence is absolute. It's this heavy, suffocating quiet where your own heartbeat sounds like a drum. Attract that limestone dust right along the edge of a massive glacial drop-off. And that is exactly where I found Julian. He was just sitting upright against this sheer wall of blue ice. The freezing air had perfectly preserved him. His skin was the color of porcelain.
Frost had crystallized right on his eyelashes.
He didn't just get lost and freeze to death, though. He had taken a bad fall from the upper ridge. But the fall wasn't what made my blood run cold. Clutched tight in his bare hand was a heavy, black emergency radio.
It wasn't civilian gear.
It was a specialized model, issued exclusively to lead rangers. I just stared at it, my mind racing to put the pieces together.
I looked up at the limestone ridge towering above us.
I dug my crampons into the ice and climbed.
When I reached the top, I found the evidence. Right under the fresh snow were the tracks of a heavy pack horse. We didn't use horses for search and rescue, but Miller owned one for hunting.
He'd been poaching in a protected zone. Julian must have startled him, and Miller chased him right off the edge.
Instead of calling for a medevac, Miller handed a dying kid a dead radio.
He left him there to freeze. I slid back down and pried that useless plastic from his fingers.
I needed his ID for the official log.
I reached into the breast pocket of his heavy parka. My fingers brushed against something cold and smooth.
I pulled it out into the light.
It was an antique silver pocket watch.
The glass face was cracked from the fall.
The hands were frozen dead at exactly 3:14 a.m.
I didn't put it in the evidence bag. I slipped it into my own pocket. I hiked back to base camp as the morning light broke over the peaks. I was practically blind with rage.
I marched straight into Miller's tent.
It was time to make him pay. I marched into his tent and threw that dead radio on his sleeping bag. He woke up with pure terror in his eyes.
For a second, I saw the real Arthur Miller. Just a cornered animal who knew he was caught.
But Miller was a survivor, and that panic didn't last. Within seconds, his face hardened into a cold, calculated mask. He looked at the radio, then looked up at me, completely dead inside. He didn't even try to buy it. I was shaking with rage, telling him I found the tracks and the kid he left to die. I reached for my shoulder mic to call the marshal and end his career.
But he didn't even try to stop me.
He just looked at me and asked how my little girl, Sarah, was doing. I froze completely. My hand hovered right over that mic. Sarah was 8 and dying of an aggressive disease. I was drowning in medical debt. He managed the department files, so he knew I was facing bankruptcy.
He stood up and offered me the most evil bribe imaginable.
If I kept my mouth shut, he'd approve a massive payout from the benevolent fund. Every cent of Sarah's bills paid. He wasn't offering me greed. He was offering me my child's life. I stood there, feeling Julian's heavy silver watch resting right over my heart. I thought about that kid waiting for a rescue, and then I thought about my daughter's laugh. I had to weigh the life of a dead stranger against the breath in my own daughter's lungs. I closed my eyes and a single tear froze on my cheek. I turned around and walked out of that tent. I took the deal. Miller wrote the report, calling it a tragic exposure death. The investigation closed in 3 days. A month later, he got his massive promotion and moved to a corner office in Anchorage. True to his word, the fund wiped out my bet. Sarah got her treatments and grew up healthy, unaware of the price paid for her survival. But I couldn't live with myself. Every time I put on that uniform, I felt like a fraud. I resigned, and my marriage fell apart anyway. I retreated back to Alaska and bought an isolated cabin right on the park boundary. I lived off my pension and basically became a ghost. But I kept Julian's cracked silver watch in my desk, a daily reminder of my cowardice. I kept Julian's cracked silver pocket watch in the top drawer of my desk. I never got it fixed. I kept it as a punishment, a daily reminder of my own cowardice. The strangeness started during my 3rd year in the cabin. It was the week of the summer solstice. The midnight sun was hanging low, casting these long, bruised shadows.
I was just sitting at my desk, drinking cheap whiskey, staring out at the mountain. Suddenly, it was a heavy, metallic tick. It echoed right through the quiet cabin. I frowned and looked around, trying to figure out where it was coming from. The sound was coming from my desk. I slowly opened the top drawer, my heart pounding. The broken silver watch was ticking. It hadn't moved a single millimeter in over 3 years, but it wasn't keeping time.
The delicate second hand was moving counterclockwise.
It was sweeping backwards, like it was erasing the seconds. I picked it up, and my hands were trembling. The metal was freezing cold. Witnessing the impossible, frost was actively forming on the cracked glass face. Right there in the warmth of my cabin, I just stared at it in absolute disbelief. The shadow of the window frame was falling directly across the watch, cast by that eerie midnight sun. It felt like the mountain itself was in the room with me. I watched it tick backwards for exactly 1 hour. The minute hand slowly retreated from 3:14 to 2:14. And then, as the sun shifted and the shadow moved off the desk, it stopped. The frost melted, and the watch was dead again. I honestly thought the isolation had finally broken my mind. But the next night, it happened again. I started keeping a log. I timed it, studying it under the midnight sun. Over the next few weeks, I realized the terrifying truth. The watch wasn't just broken, it was unwinding, counting backward through the exact 72 hours Julian had been missing. It was a countdown. The mountain's memory, demanding blood for blood. For almost 2 decades, I sat in that cabin watching the years slip by. I watched Arthur Miller rise to power, becoming completely untouchable. Meanwhile, I was trapped in my guilt, waiting for the mountain to collect its debt. Every single summer, I'd sit at that desk and watch those silver hands slowly tick backward toward zero. The psychological toll of it was just unbearable. I knew that when it finally unwound those 72 hours, something was going to happen. Then, last week, the watch reached its final hour. It stopped dead at 4:14 a.m., which meant there were exactly 60 minutes left. And honestly, a strange kind of calm washed over me, because I knew the waiting was finally over. I picked up my satellite phone and dialed the private number for the regional director's office down in Anchorage. I just listened to it ring, my heart steady for the first time in years. Miller answered, and his voice was older, thicker, and just dripping with arrogance. He demanded to know who was calling, and I just softly said, "It's Elias." There was this long, dead silence on the line. I could almost hear the blood draining right out of his face before he finally hissed at me, asking what I wanted. I lied to him. I told him I still had that emergency radio he gave Julian, and that tomorrow morning I was taking it straight to the federal marshal. I told him my daughter was grown. I didn't need his money anymore, and I had absolutely nothing left to lose. He tried to say I was bluffing, but I could hear the genuine panic catching in his throat. I gave him my address and told him to come alone tonight to get the radio, or his entire life would burn to the ground. Then, I just hung up. I knew Miller's pride, and I knew how desperate he was to protect his precious legacy. He wasn't going to send the police or hire some thug to do his dirty work. He'd come himself to handle the loose end, exactly like he did 22 years ago. He showed up at 2 in the morning, right at the peak of the solstice. The midnight sun was bleeding this dark, fiery gold over the horizon. Outside, the wind was just howling off the glaciers, rattling the glass in my cabin windows. I sat perfectly still at my desk, The silver pocket watch was resting on the wood right in front of me. I could hear the heavy crunch of his boots stepping up to the porch, just waiting for a confrontation 22 years in the making. The front door kicked open. Miller stood in the doorway. He was wearing an expensive coat, but he looked small.
He looked old.
His face was twisted in pure hatred. He locked the door behind him and pulled out a heavy black revolver. He leveled the gun right at my chest. He called me a broken old man. He said he was going to put a bullet in my head and put a bottle of whiskey in my hand. He'd write the report himself. A tragic, isolated, emotional distress. Nobody would ask a single question. I didn't take my eyes off him. I just told him quietly that I didn't have the radio. He stepped closer. His finger tightened on the trigger. He told me I died for absolutely nothing. I told him I didn't bring him here for the radio.
I pointed to the desk.
I told him I brought him here for the watch. Miller frowned. His eyes darted to the silver timepiece. He scoffed, asking what the hell I was talking about. At that exact moment, the sun dipped just low enough over the mountains. The long shadow of the window frame crept across the floor. It climbed the desk, and it fell perfectly across the face of the pocket watch. The temperature in the cabin dropped 30 degrees in a single second. I saw Miller's breath plume into a thick white cloud. He shivered, taking a step back in total confusion. The walls began to pop and groan from the sudden cold. Ice started to spiderweb across the inside of the windows. And then the sound began. A heavy tick. Miller jumped, swinging the gun toward the desk. The watch was moving. The second hand was sweeping backward. Tick. His voice was trembling. He whispered, asking what it was. I told him it was unwinding. It had been counting backward for 22 years. Counting down the hours that kid sat in the dark, waiting for him. He screamed at me to shut up. He aimed the gun back at me, his hand shaking violently. The cold in the room was absolute. It was a glacial freeze that burned the lungs. He yelled that it was a trick, that I wired something in there. I just told him to look at the time. He couldn't help himself. He looked down at the dial. The minute hand was sliding backward. 3:17. 3:16. 3:15. I told him it was almost over. The watch hit 3:14 a.m. And then the ticking stopped. The silence that followed was the heaviest, most terrifying absence of sound I've ever felt. It felt like the air itself had died. Suddenly, the locked deadbolt on my front door snapped in half. It sounded exactly like a gunshot. The heavy oak door violently blew open, slamming against the wall. A wall of freezing, dense white fog rolled right into the cabin. It smelled like ancient ice and pulverized limestone. And outside, the howling wind had completely died. Miller stumbled backward, dropping his gun on the floor. He was staring out the open doorway into the twilight. His eyes were wide with absolute primal terror. He just made this pathetic, whimpering sound in the back of his throat. I looked out the door. Standing 50 yards away, right at the edge of the tree line, was a silhouette. It was just standing there in the golden light of the midnight sun, casting a long, dark shadow toward the cabin. We were all wearing heavy parkas, and as it took a step forward, it dragged its right leg, dragging it at a sickening, unnatural angle. In that freezing silence, I heard something else. The distinct, rhythmic crackle of radio static. Coming right from the trees. Miller didn't even scream. His mind was utterly broken by the impossible reality standing in front of him, and he simply turned and ran. He ran blindly into the deep woods, plunging into the freezing fog in a mindless panic. I didn't follow him. I didn't try to stop him. I just walked over to the open doorway, and I watched the fog swallow him whole. I stood there until the cold became unbearable, and then I quietly closed the door. The mountain had balanced its ledger. The debt was finally paid. They found Arthur Miller's body 3 days later. He didn't make it far before the cold took him. Just ran blindly into the whiteout, completely out of his mind. He was 8 miles deep into the restricted sector of the park, way off the road, out where nobody goes. Hard truth. The elements out there don't care who you are or what badge you wear. The official autopsy report stated he got disoriented in the twilight. Said he wandered off the road and succumbed to the extreme drop in temperature. Just another guy who underestimated the wild. Exposure. A tragic, unpreventable death. It was the exact same lie he wrote 22 years ago. Funny how the mountain handles its own justice. I still live in the cabin. I don't really have a reason to leave anymore. But that crushing weight that sat on my chest for 2 decades? It's finally gone. The mountain balanced its ledger. It took back exactly what was stolen from it all those years ago. Blood for blood. Time for time. The debt is finally paid in full. The silver pocket watch still sits in the top drawer of my desk. I didn't throw it away. I actually look at it every day now. Not as a punishment, but as a reminder. The glass is still cracked right down the middle. The metal is still heavily tarnished from the cold. It's still just a broken piece of machinery sitting in a drawer. Or at least, that's what I thought. Yesterday evening, the midnight sun cast its shadow across the room. The light hit the silver casing just right. I was just sitting there, watching the dust float in the air. And then I saw it. I watched the second hand twitch against the dial. It didn't go backwards this time, erasing the past. For the first time in 22 long years, it ticked forward. The watch ticking forward filled the quiet cabin. It wasn't heavy or hollow anymore. It was the steady sound of normal time resuming. Peaceful closure. The second hand swept clockwise, leaving that frozen hour behind. I sat back, letting that rhythmic ticking wash over me. A profound release flooded my chest. For the first time in decades, I took a deep breath without that crushing weight. I reached out and gently closed the drawer. The watch stayed inside. No longer a cursed countdown. The debt was paid in full, and the mountain had finally let me go. I pushed myself up from the desk, feeling lighter than I had in years. I walked slowly across the floorboards toward the window. The golden twilight bathed the cabin in a forgiving glow. I stood at the window, looking out at the majestic peak of Mount Foraker. It didn't feel like a judge anymore. It was just a beautiful, indifferent force of nature. The rugged spruce trees swayed gently in the freezing wind. The tundra stretched out endlessly under the daylight. The wilderness had reclaimed its balance, burying the past beneath pristine snow. I stepped away from the window and pulled my heavy parka from its hook. I shrugged it on, and the familiar weight felt comforting. I was finally ready to step back outside. I opened the heavy front door and stepped out onto the porch. The freezing Alaskan air hit my face, filling my lungs with clean energy. The midnight sun washed over me. I looked out over the vast wilderness that defined my life. The stillness was broken only by the distant wind. I was alone, but for the first time, I wasn't lonely. The majestic Alaska range stands eternal under that surreal sky.
The season of the midnight sun continues its endless cycle. The mountain keeps its memory safe. And time finally moves forward.